As we do this study, I want you to understand not all of these pictures are mine. Not all of these ideas are mine. I stole them from other people. The problem is, over 40 years of ministry, I can't remember where I got them all from. And they're part of what I understand and believe now. So just realize that general disclaimer is it's not all mine. This session, we're going to be looking at the Bible. First, we're going to talk, where did it come from? And then in the next section, we're going to talk about what do we need to know to understand it. Now, I want you to understand from the very start, because people tend to misunderstand what I say. I believe the Bible came from God. It is God's word for us today. But now I also understand that God used people. He used people to write it down. He used people to copy it. He used people to translate it. And he used people to compile it into what we have today. Now, I believe he would have taken these people and made them into what he wanted to be. He had to have a Paul to write the book of Romans. He had to have a David to write the book of Psalms, mainly. He had to have a Solomon to write the Proverbs. He created people who wrote them down and copied them. Is it one book? Well, not really. It's actually 66 different books written over a time span by 40 authors over 1,600 years between 1500 BC and 100 AD. The amazing thing is that it is so consistent throughout. Even though you had 40 authors writing over all different kinds of cultural time periods and different time zones with different people, it still is consistent from place to place to place throughout it. And that's what I think makes it God's word. Now, we need to talk about the word canon. No, we're not talking about these. These have two ends in the middle. We're talking about inspired writings. There are certain sets of books in every religion that are considered to be inspired writings, or the canon of those religions. In ours, we have two sets. We have an Old Testament, which is the Hebrew canon, and we have the New Testament, or the additions by the Christians. Let's look at the Old Testament Hebrew Bible first. The oldest scriptures that we have are the Dead Sea Scrolls, the pieces and copies of this. They're about 100 BC, 100 years before Christ. This placed them several hundred years after the original events that happened and after the original copies. We do not have any original copies of the Old Testament books. The first part of the Bible is called the Torah, the first 5 books. Pentateuch also means 5 books. And these are the 5 books of what they call the law. Now, when did they come into existence? In 640 BC, Josiah became king. He was a young king. The kings before him had been worshiping idols in the temple itself that had been built by Solomon. He asked the priests to clean out that temple and get it ready for worship. As they cleaned the temple, they found a book there of the law. They brought it to Josiah, and Josiah, oh my gosh, we haven't been following this. We need to reform the people. And they had a great reform. Most people think that this was what we call the Torah. But where it really appears totally is in 450 BC, about 200 years later, Ezra, a priest, after the Babylonian captivity, brings something back he calls the law. And he reads it to the people and has it interpreted to the people, and they decide to live by this. And this is probably the first time we have what we would call these 5 books today. Now the next section is history. The history books were written as the events happened. These are like Joshua and Judges, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 1st and 2nd Samuel. All of those books that were written about the historical events, Ezra, Nehemiah, they were written at the time of the historical events. Then we have the poetry. We have a book about love songs. We have another monologue on the meaning of life called Ecclesiastes. We have a book of hymns called Psalms. We have a death dirge for Jerusalem called the Lamentations. They are all written at various times by various people. Then we have what we call the prophets. They are scattered over several hundred years, but before 200 BC. Now we have the minor and the major prophets. These were written on scrolls. Now you can't have a scroll, a huge scroll, so a scroll can only be so big to be carried around. Several of the books, including Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and Daniel, were all written on one scroll each. The others were written on one scroll all together because they're so small. And because of that, these are called the major prophets and these are called the minor prophets. Now, we move on down to Alexandria, Egypt, and a thing called the Septuagint in 285 BC. In Alexandria, they were building a huge library of all the writings of the world. They wanted a copy of the Jewish Bible. They wanted it translated into Greek. So now the legend is that 70 scholars got together in 70 different rooms and over a 70-day period of time produced identical copies from Hebrew to Greek translations. That's what Septuagint means, 70. Probably not, but the Jewish scholars translated it into Greek. Now this is important because this is the Bible of Jesus and his disciples. This is the Bible that they're going to be using when they preach and teach. We know that because the Septuagint changes a few things. You cannot translate the Bible from one language to another and get exactly the same thing, because the problem is sometimes words aren't equivalent across. For instance, Greek has many different words for love. We have one. So we translate all those words into one word. On the other hand, we have spirit, we have wind, and we have soul, but they're all or even just pneuma in Greek. So it's hard to translate, so we can tell that it is the Greek version that they're using. Now there were many flavors of Judaism in the time of Jesus, just like we have today. We have Catholics, Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists, etc. Each believing slightly different. In Jesus' day, first we had the Sadducees. They only believed in the Torah was God-breathed. The rest of it, they didn't accept of what we call the Old Testament. The first 5 books is all they accepted. They were in control in the temple, and Jesus runs into them when he runs into the high priest and the other priests. We have the Pharisees. They believed all of what we call the Old Testament was inspired by God. He runs into these when he runs into them in the synagogues in Galilee and in other places where he bumps into Pharisees. You had the Zealots. Jesus had one of these on his staff. They believed in all of the Old Testament, but from a liberation point of view, that God is always out to help the poor and to bring them to freedom. Then you have the Essenes. They took all the Old Testament, plus many other writings. They were anti-temple. They didn't believe in the temple. And they were adding writings like the Sons of the Lights, the Wars of the Good and Evil, and things like that, their manuals and all. This is what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. So not everybody believed in everything we talk about as being the Bible today, in Jesus' day. So what happened is, in 90 AD, at a place called Yamnia, the Jewish people got together. Their temple has been destroyed in 70 AD. They need to know what the scriptures are. Every synagogue has been operating independent with different scriptures. They got together and decided what's going to go into the Old Testament. They used criteria to follow. The first criteria was it was written before 400 BC. They thought it was written before that time period. Second, a popular name as an author, for instance, Moses, or people like that, David, Daniel, etc. If it had a popular name for an author. Third, popularity. This might have been the biggest one. If our little synagogue here had 2 or 3 books that nobody else was using, well, then they probably weren't put into the Bible. On the other hand, if almost every synagogue was using Isaiah, let's say, then it's put in. Nextly, you have survival. Realize that these books were written on scrolls that were easily burned and destroyed, and we have times of war and fighting and famines and all these things going on all the time, cities being destroyed. Maybe the only copy of one of these books was destroyed. We know, for instance, there's books like it'll say something like, if you want to know more about this king, go to the Chronicles of the Kings of Judah, or go to the Chronicles of the Kings of Israel. Well, those 2 books don't exist anymore. We've never found a copy of them. So it just didn't exist. Now, again, I want to emphasize, God is using these men to do this. If he wanted it to survive, it would have survived. If he wanted it to be popular, it would have been popular. It was put in if he wanted it in, and it's left out if he wanted it left out. Now, they discussed several books in great detail. Ezekiel had a lot of weird images in it. Some people think they're flying saucers and all. But they put it in eventually. Song of Solomon, it's too sexual, they thought. Esther, it never mentions the word God anywhere in the whole Bible on the book. Daniel, it again is kind of weird. So these were considered and finally put in. Then we move to 500 AD and what we call the Masoretic text. They had been having problems with copying. And some people had slightly different versions than others. So in 500 AD, they got back together again and they pulled and said, this is going to be our text. This is the gold standard. Everything will be measured by this one text. And they destroyed everything else that they could find. Now, obviously, they didn't destroy the Dead Sea Scrolls because they didn't find it. And we find that what we have today is what's called the Masoretic text. And when you compare it to 600-year-old, older than that, text in the Dead Sea Scrolls, especially the book of Isaiah, they're identical. So therefore, it hasn't changed. Now, let's talk a little bit about rabbinical teachings. Halakha are interpretations of the law. They usually have been oral, but they're finally written down. Haggadah are interpretations of historical and religious passages with new details and stories. Basically, these are traditional stories and things that the rabbis have added throughout the years. Well, Rabbi Gamaliel told this story. The Mishnah is a collection of these rabbinic discussions of the law. So they put the Halakha and the Haggadah together with other rabbinic discussions discussing the law. Now the Mishnah, so they discuss the law. Then the Talmud is the interpretation of the Mishnah. They have a Babylonian one and a Palestinian one. So what the Talmud is the interpretation of the Word of God. The Talmud is about the size of the Encyclopedia Britannica. It's huge. So, and then we have going into the New Testament. The first letters, things that were written, were Paul's letters, most likely. Then the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and Acts were written. Matthew, Mark, and Luke are called the Synoptic Gospels because they follow a sequence. We think Mark was written first, and then Luke and Matthew looked at it, had a copy of it, and said, okay, we can add some more to that. And they each added their materials. Then the other letters were written, and finally the Gospel of John comes into existence. And he says, I know a whole lot more about this, and let me add some things before I die. Now the New Testament, the oldest manuscripts we have are about 200 AD. These are getting much closer than the Old Testament to the originals. I mean, some of these were only written about 80 or 90, something like that. So we have some fairly close to the originals, but we do not have any of the original text scriptures. Again, the church was having a problem. In 363 AD, Constantine becomes Roman emperor. He's a Christian for the first time. He wants to convert the entire nation, Roman Empire, into Christianity. But he needs to know what to teach them. Problem is, when he asked the scholars, what are y'all's books, your Randy, your canon? They didn't know. I mean, this Sunday got this church over here was using these books, this one over here was using those books, etc., etc. So they got together and did the same thing that the Jews did in Yamnia and Laodicea, and they decided what's in and what's out. This is a picture of the ruins of Laodicea. There's not much there today. What was the criteria? Well, they were almost the same as the ones the Jews used. Survivability. Remember, they're writing letters. A letter can easily be destroyed, burned, torn up, soiled, lost. Well, actually, we think we have 2nd and 4th Corinthians, not 1st and 2nd. We think there was a letter he wrote before the first one, and there's a letter he wrote in between. He's obviously answering questions. And so we think there was a back and forth going on, but only these two survived. 1st century dating, it had to be before 100 AD. Connected with a popular name, Luke, Matthew, Mark, John, Peter, Paul, etc. And popularity, again. If only one synagogue, one church is using it, then it probably didn't make it in. If all of the churches were using it as holy, then it did make it in. Now again, I am not saying people did this. I'm saying God did this. He used these people for his purposes. He made it survive. He made it popular. So that is how we got what we call the New Testament today. Then in this room, underneath the Church of the Nativity, in 382, Jerome produced the Vulgate. It took him 4 years to do it. In 382, he finished it. What is the Vulgate? That is the first of what we call the Bible today. It had an Old Testament and a New Testament all in it. It was all translated into Latin from the original Hebrew and Greek. And this is the Latin Bible, and this will be the Bible for many centuries to come. There's a picture of Jerome out in the thing. Now, let's deal with something for a few minutes. The Nag Hammadi Scriptures. Usually around Easter or Christmas, you'll have a show on the Discovery Channel, National Geographic, the Learning Channel, something like that, about the books left out of the Bible. And why were they left out? It is because those Christians were bigots and they didn't want women running things, or et cetera, et cetera. Now, what the Nag Hammadi Gnostic Gospels are, there are some texts, the Gospel of Judas, the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, and several others, books. We need to understand these are Gnostic writings. They were never considered to be Christian writing. The Gnostics are a totally different religion. They believe that all religions have a core. And if you can boil all religions down to this one core of what they all commonly believe, and Gnostic means knowledge, have the special knowledge to understand it all, that's what you did. They were never considered to be Christian writings. If somebody wrote a story about Muhammad being a homosexual pervert, because it's about Muhammad, would it have to be included in the Quran? No, it wouldn't. So people writing these were writing for another religion, and for some reason they want to question why we didn't put it in our Bible. Well, because it's not Christian writings. Now, another part that some people think about, the Apocrypha. The Apocrypha is books, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom, Sirach, Baruch, 1st and 2nd and 3rd and 4th Maccabees, which is good history, 1st and 2nd Esdras, Prayer of Manasseh, Enoch, Jubilees, Jasher, Psalms 151, and all of the apocryphal additions to Daniel and Esther, including the prayer of Azira and Susanna and Bel and the dragon. These writings you find in some Bibles and you don't in others. You find them in Catholic Bibles. They're additions to the Catholic Bible. What we need to understand is they were in the Septuagint. They were actually put into the Septuagint and were there to when it was produced, that Greek Bible. They were in the Vulgate, therefore. But they were both put in back in an appendix that says these are good writings, but they're not inspired. The Protestants rejected it. Why? Well, this is an area where Catholics get views that the Protestants don't accept, such as saying Mass for the dead, or saying purgatory, or things like that. And we need to understand that those were not Protestant views, so they totally rejected them and didn't put them in their Bible. Well, as a knee-jerk reaction, they were canonized by the Catholics in 1546 at the Council on Trent, said, okay, if y'all are going to keep them, we'll keep them. And this is where they get some of their views that we don't currently have in Protestantism. Now, the original text for the Old Testament was in Hebrew. This is modern Hebrew. You see these little dots and dashes and squiggly marks all around the writing. Those are called vowel points. That tells you what vowel goes there. The original Hebrew was not like that. It was like this. It had no vowels. It was all consonants. So when you read, it looked like this. Now, what does that mean? Could that mean Jody is God? Or maybe it means judo us good. Either one would be, you put in different letters. It's one of the problems of Hebrew. The original text in New Testament was Greek. This is Koine Greek. It's written in all capital letters, no punctuation and no spacing between words. So therefore you have this. Now that could be Alan is an Iceman on Sundays or Alan is a nice man on Sundays. Could be either one. This is some of the problems you have in translating. And we also have to realize that the New Testament is in Greek, but it's probably that Jesus spoke Aramaic. And then it was translated into Greek and then translated into English. And every time he translated it, it gets different. Problem is, for instance, there has been the whole church split between Eastern Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church over the idea of what communion means. This is my body, this is my blood. Does it literally become the blood and body of Jesus Christ or not? Is it symbolic of it? And the whole church split over that, when actually the word is doesn't even probably appear there because Aramaic doesn't have the present tense is. It probably says, this my body, this my blood, is what Jesus said. So we have problems when we start to worry about translating. Now, in 735, the first parts of the English Bible were produced. In 1228, chapters were added by Stephen Langston. Up until then, there were no chapters. There wasn't any such thing as John chapter 3 or Psalm 23. In 1382, the entire Bible was translated. In 1448, verses were added to the Old Testament. Up until then, you didn't have, there was no such thing as 1 Chronicles 12:13. The first printed English Bible was the Coverdale Bible in 1525. Verses were added to the New Testament. John 3:16 didn't come into existence until 1551. Now, the modern English translations, let's talk about them just a few minutes and we'll be finished. The King James Version was written in 1611. It was written by 54 scholars and is on a 12th grade reading level. The New King James was produced as a revised version and it's on an 8th grade reading level. The Revised Standard Version was in 1952 by a group of 32 scholars considered for revision of the New Testament in 71, and it's on an 8th grade level. The Amplified Bible is in 1954, multiple translations using 27 other translations. It combines things. It says like, the lovely, beauty, wonderful, good-looking person. So it used many things. The Living Bible is a paraphrase. It is not a translation. It is a paraphrase written by Kenneth Taylor, one person, as he read the American Standard Version and then translated what he thought into an 8th grade reading level for his children. The New American Standard in 1971 is a new translation by 54 scholars from the original Greek and Hebrew text. All translation decisions were made by consensus, and it tries to maintain the original word order as much as possible. It's on an 11th grade reading level, and it was the New International Version was translated in 1973 by the International Bible Society on a 7th grade reading level. The Good News for Modern Man is a paraphrase produced by the American Bible Society. Again, it is a paraphrase. It is not a word for word, but it takes and gives it what they think is what it's trying to say. It's on a 7th grade level. And the last one we'll look at is the Message in 2002. It fully came out. Parts of it came out as early as 1993. It's translated from the original Greek and Hebrew scriptures by Eugene Peterson in contemporary language and reviewed by other biblical scholars for accuracy. But again, it's one man translating it and others looking at it as accuracy. And this brings us to the end.